awful manner which with so many are acting now.
And these past several weeks have been deeply painful for many in this country. Today is a painful day for millions of women all across the country who are rightly worried about losing their basic civil rights. It's a painful day for the brave and courageous survivors who have had to relive their trauma, and in some cases have found the courage to tell their story for the very first time. It's also a painful day for men who hope to see this Senate stand on the right side of history. Today, in just a few hours, the United States Senate is going to turn its back on righteousness. It's going to turn its back on fairness and reason. And make no mistake, it is going to turn its back on women. What we've seen over the last few weeks is an exercise of power. Who has it and who doesn't? Rather than a search for the truth, we've seen those in power ram through a nominee who is unfit to serve on the Supreme Court. Ultimately, this is about the power structure of America. But it's changing, and it's changing fast. So I want to say something right here from the Senate floor to every woman in America who is listening. I hear you. Many of my colleagues in the Senate hear you. We hear your stories, we hear your voices, and we will be certain they will not go unheard. I've heard from constituents all across my state. I've been talking to people for the last several months, and I've been talking to people specifically about this nominee for the past several weeks. I've heard from friends who have been sexually assaulted. I've heard from friends whose daughters have been sexually assaulted. I've heard from people who are outraged about what's happening in this country right now, outraged at a process that doesn't seek the truth and doesn't seem to be fair. And unfortunately, it's a moment when survivors are having to relive the worst moments of their lives in real time by just watching the news. So I'm going to read a little bit of information that was submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 27 by Jessica Davidson from End Rape on Campus. She writes a very heartfelt letter about her own trauma, about her own experience with sexual violence, and about the representation that she provides from her organization. She writes, "We envision a world in which each individual has an educational experience free from violence, and until then, that all survivors are believed, trusted, and supported. Each year, we assist nearly 1,000 survivors and their families directly, conduct educational campaigns, support student activists, and to advocate for policy reform efforts that reach millions of individuals." She asks, how many more viral online moments must be created before an incredible harm and trauma we've experienced is enough to be taken seriously when a survivor comes forward? And why is the burden always shifted to those who have experienced the harm? She says that an American is sexually assaulted every 98 seconds. Just imagine how many lives are being destroyed. She says that more than an estimated 17,700,000 women and 2,780,000 men have experienced an attempted or completed rape since 1998. 3 million college students will be sexually assaulted this fall alone. 18,900 military service members bravely serving our country experienced sexual assault in 2014, and 1 in every 4 voters in the United States is a survivor. More than half of all voters in the United States know a survivor. Survivors make up a significant portion of each United States senator's constituencies, and survivors everywhere deserve to know that if they come forward, they will be taken seriously. I've received hundreds of calls, thousands of calls, hundreds of letters, and I've read some of those letters this morning, and they're so disturbing and so upsetting. And I can't imagine what that must be like to deal with in this moment that we're in, when you have members of the Senate who either don't believe credible survivors, or if they do believe them, they don't care. But for every survivor out there who feels that she is not being heard, not being listened to, not being believed, I want you to know that there are those of us here who do believe you, who have heard you, and will fight for you. Your voices are being heard, and they do matter. And your willingness to protest, to stand tall, to speak out, and to speak clearly over these last few weeks has been extraordinary. It's been powerful, it's been meaningful, it's made a difference. So do not fear that what you have done was a waste of time. Do not fear that speaking out doesn't matter, because it does. And the energy and the inspiration that you have created is going to drive this movement forward. I also want to talk a little bit about why Brett Kavanaugh should not be serving on the Supreme Court, why he doesn't deserve this seat. And I want to talk a lot about his record and what we know about Brett Kavanaugh as an individual. Over these last few weeks, we've learned a lot about this nominee, even before we found out that more than one woman had accused Judge Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her. His judicial record was already clear, and many of us made our decisions to oppose Judge Kavanaugh based on that record, that judicial record and statements alone. That was the first reason I opposed him, because I have no doubt that he will undermine women's rights on the Supreme Court. I'll say more about his judicial record in a moment, but what we all saw and heard over the last few weeks isn't something that you can actually discern from a judicial record. More than one woman has come forward with sworn statements under penalty of perjury saying that Brett Kavanaugh committed acts of sexual misconduct against them. One of them, Dr. Blasey Ford, even bravely testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. She was under oath, and she relived one of the worst moments of her life on national television. And she was credible. I believed her. When my colleagues asked her what she remembered most clearly, her strongest memory was the laughter. She said, indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the laugh, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense. She said, quote, they were laughing with each other. And she said, quote, I was, you know, underneath one of them while the two laughed. Two friends having a really good time with one another. And Mr. President, Madam President, she was direct. And she did not evade any questions. She did not duck or dodge like someone who was trying to hide the truth. When my colleagues asked her with what degree of certainty did she believe that Brett Kavanaugh assaulted her, she said 100%. When I was watching her testimony, sitting there in the room, there were many moments when her testimony brought me to tears. I thought the way she opened was particularly moving. She said, "I'm here today not because I want to be. I'm terrified. I'm here because I believe it is my civic duty to tell you what happened to me while Brett Kavanaugh and I were in high school. I agonized daily with this decision throughout August and early September 2018. The sense of duty that motivated me to reach out confidentially to the Washington Post, Representative Eshu's office, and Senator Feinstein's office was always there. But my fears of the consequences of speaking out started to increase. During August 2018, the press reported that Mr. Kavanaugh's confirmation was virtually certain. His allies painted him as a champion of women's rights and empowerment. I believed that if I came forward, my voice would be drowned out by a chorus of powerful supporters. By the time the confirmation hearings, I had resigned myself to remaining quiet and letting the committee and the Senate make their decision without knowing what Mr. Kavanaugh had done to me. At the same time, my greatest fears have been realized, and the reality has been far worse than I expected. Apart from the assault itself, these last couple of weeks have been the hardest of my life. I have had to relive my trauma in front of the entire world and have seen my life picked apart by people on television, in the media, and in this body who have never met or spoken with me. I have been accused of acting out of partisan political motives. Those who say that do not know me, I am a fiercely independent person, and I am no one's pawn. My motivation in coming forward was to provide the facts about how Mr. Kavanaugh's actions have damaged my life so that you can take that into serious consideration as you make your decisions about how to proceed. It is not my responsibility to determine whether Mr. Kavanaugh deserves to sit on the Supreme Court. My responsibility is to tell the truth. That's a woman of extraordinary humility and extraordinary courage. I want to compare Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony to Judge Kavanaugh's testimony right after her. We all saw it. Some of my colleagues have suggested that because multiple women were making very credible accusations against Judge Kavanaugh, that he had a right to be angry, that he was right to come out strong and fight back, like a politician would. Really? Is that how a judge is supposed to act? Not according to Judge Kavanaugh. I want to quote from a law review article he wrote 2 years ago about how a good judge is supposed to act. Quote, "To be a good judge and a good umpire, it's critical that you have the proper demeanor. We must walk in the shoes of other judges, the lawyers, and the parties. It's important to understand them, to keep our emotions in check, to be calm amidst the storm, to put it in the vernacular, to be a good umpire and a good judge. Don't be a jerk." Mr. President, Judge Kavanaugh would have been well served to listen to his own advice. I was shocked by his tirade against my colleagues and my party. I was disturbed by its vindictiveness, his animosity. I want to quote from his testimony to remind you of exactly what he said at his hearing. "Every time I see these words, I'm in disbelief that a sitting federal judge, a nominee of the Supreme Court, said them to the Judiciary Committee in prepared testimony under oath. He said, quote, "This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with the apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. Madam President, Supreme Court justices are supposed to be thinking about the law and only the law, not elections, not political parties. But now we know exactly what Judge Kavanaugh is thinking about. He's thinking about politics. He's thinking about left-wing conspiracies. He's thinking about the 2016 election and Trump and the Clintons. Madam President, those aren't my words. Those are his words, his testimony. He said them directly to the committee under oath while the entire nation was watching. He showed us his true colors. He showed us what he does when he's under pressure. He showed us how he really feels about our politics and our political parties, even though he said he always stays far away from politics because judges aren't supposed to go there. He showed us what he really thinks deep down when his back is against a wall. Think about that, Madam President. A sitting federal judge, a nominee to the Supreme Court, shouted about Democrats trying to take him down. It makes me wonder, even if you love every judicial decision this judge has ever written, how can any of my colleagues argue after hearing that tirade that this judge is unbiased? It makes me wonder how any of my colleagues can ignore that fact. It makes me wonder, to my colleagues who are so desperate to confirm Brett Kavanaugh at all costs, what decisions by this judge are you so eager to see? What do you already know about how this supposedly fair-minded judge is going to rule that you would risk the court's reputation by putting such a blatant partisan on the bench? A retired Supreme Court Justice, John Paul Stevens, who was appointed by a Republican, even came so far as to change his mind and oppose Judge Kavanaugh. Why? Because Judge Kavanaugh is now clearly biased. He said, quote, "He has demonstrated a potential bias involving potential litigants before the court that he would not be able to perform its full responsibilities." And I think there is merit in that criticism and that the senators should really pay attention to it. For the good of the court, it's not healthy to get a new justice that can only do a part-time job. I agree with that, Madam President. When the next big gerrymandering case comes before the Supreme Court, we already know how Judge Kavanaugh feels about Democrats because we heard it directly from him at the hearing. So we can't expect him to rule fairly in that case. Or what if a forced arbitration case related to sexual harassment comes before the court? We all heard Judge Kavanaugh say under oath that credible allegations of sexual assault are nothing but a left-wing conspiracy. So we can't expect him to rule fairly on that one either. There are real consequences to the bias and partisanship and anger that Judge Kavanaugh showed at his hearing. I'm incredibly disappointed by this, and I hope my colleagues think about this one last time before they cast their votes today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about his record as a judge. Whose side does he take? Who does he believe? In one case, in a dissent, Judge Kavanaugh said that employers should not have to give their workers insurance that covers birth control if they don't want to. In other words, he thinks a boss's religion is more important than a worker's religion. Does that sound fair to you, Madam President? In another case, he had to decide whether a pregnant teenage immigrant girl should be allowed to have an abortion. He made her wait for 9 weeks before he said no, and then he was overruled by his judicial colleagues. He said that he didn't think what he did to the girl was an undue burden. Does that sound fair to you? Let's not forget, President Trump said he wanted the new Supreme Court justice to overturn Roe v. Wade, that he wanted to nominate someone who would automatically vote to overturn it. He chose Brett Kavanaugh to get the job done. Mr. President, if this chamber confirms Judge Kavanaugh, I have no doubt that the Supreme Court will take away women's reproductive rights. I have no doubt that the Supreme Court will move to tell women that they aren't allowed to make their own decisions with their own doctors about their own health. And I want to speak about another part of his record. Judge Kavanaugh wrote in an opinion that if the president doesn't like a law, that a president could ignore the law and ignore the courts. This is what he said. And Mr. President, as you listen to this, let me know if you think this is judicially sound judgment. He wrote, "Under the Constitution, the president may decline to enforce a statute that regulates private individuals when the president deems the statute unconstitutional, even if a court has held or would hold the statute constitutional. Anyone with the most basic understanding of how our constitutional system of government works knows that this is not what our founding fathers designed. Anyone who has been paying attention to President Trump's attacks on our institutions and his repeated attempts to undermine the Mueller investigation should be alarmed by that statement alone. It makes me think President Trump's choice for this nominee was because he wanted to be protected from the Mueller investigation. I'm also deeply concerned about Judge Kavanaugh's record on money in politics. It should come as no surprise that Judge Kavanaugh is on the side of big money interests that are currently polluting our political system. Judge Kavanaugh was handpicked by White House counsel Don McGahn, a former FEC commissioner who was notorious for his hostility towards campaign finance laws. Indeed, Judge Kavanaugh fulfills President Trump's promise to nominate individuals in the mold of Justice Scalia, a steadfast opponent to campaign finance regulations. Like McGahn and Justice Scalia, Kavanaugh has made his opposition to campaign finance laws clear during his time on the D.C. Circuit. In 2001, Kavanaugh authored an opinion that would allow foreign nationals, and listen to this, to spend unlimited funds on issue ads in U.S. elections. Let me say that again. Allows foreign nationals to spend unlimited funds on issue ads in U.S. elections. That's the Blumen versus FEC decision. Kavanaugh presided over a lawsuit brought by foreign persons living in the United States who wanted to make campaign contributions to candidates in U.S. federal elections. Although Kavanaugh upheld provisions of federal election law banning foreign persons from contributing directly to a candidate or a party, Kavanaugh found that federal election law, quote, does not restrain foreign nationals from speaking out about issues or spending money to advocate their views about issues. Under his reading of federal election law in Blumen, Kavanaugh would only take issue with a small fraction of the election meddling perpetrated by Russian operatives indicted by Special Counsel Mueller. At his confirmation hearing, Judge Kavanaugh was given the opportunity to directly address the possibility that his decision in Blumen opened the door for, quote, Vladimir Putin to buy issue ads in American elections. Judge Kavanaugh's response to Senator Whitehouse was misleading, indicating that the Supreme Court affirmed the case unanimously, which, while true as to foreign contributions to candidates, was not true on the point of issue ads. Indeed, Judge Kavanaugh's response to a question for the record from Senator Coons also revealed his misleading response to Senator Whitehouse's question. He wrote, quote, the challengers in Blumen did not seek to make contributions to organizations that make expenditures on issue ads. The opinion made clear that the court's holding does not address whether Congress might bar foreign nationals living temporarily in the United States from issue advocacy and speaking out on issues of public policy. The Supreme Court unanimously affirmed the decision. Judge Kavanaugh seeks to have it both ways. He brags about his opinion being unanimously upheld by the court, but when he is confronted with the real-world consequences of his decision, he hides behind the pleadings. According to Special Counsel Mueller's indictment, the issue ads run by Russian operatives seeking to meddle in the 2016 election include the messages, quote, join R, hashtag Hillary Clinton for prison 2016, end of quote. I don't even want to read the others, they're so horrible. Donald wants to defeat terrorism, Hillary wants to support it. Yet, Judge Kavanaugh's Blumen decision would permit foreign actors to run advertisements like the ones above without consequences. In fact, legal briefs filed by lawyers for the Russian operatives indicted by Special Counsel Mueller cite Kavanaugh's Blumen opinion for the proposition that foreign nationals are not barred from issue advocacy, such as what is described in the indictment. Judge Kavanaugh opposes limitations on big money in politics. During his confirmation hearing, Judge Kavanaugh was confronted with an email he wrote in March 2002 by Senator Klobuchar, wherein he suggested that contribution limits would be unconstitutional. Quote, and I have heard very few people say that the limits on contributions to candidates are unconstitutional, although I, for one, tend to think those limits have some constitutional problems. When Senator Klobuchar pressed Judge Kavanaugh on whether he believed contribution limits have constitutional problems, Judge Kavanaugh evaded the question and issued a non-responsive answer. In 2016 American Enterprise Institute speech, Kavanaugh said that political spending absolutely, end of quote, deserves First Amendment protection because, quote, to make your voice heard in politics, you need to raise money to be able to communicate to others in any kind of effective way. In 2009, in Emily's List versus FEC, Kavanaugh heard a challenge to multiple FEC regulations restricting the use of hard money by not-for-profit organizations in federal elections. These particular regulations were passed in striking down these regulations. Kavanaugh held that nonprofit organizations are, quote, constitutionally entitled to raise and spend unlimited money in support of candidates for elected office, because it's implausible that contributions to independent expenditure political committees are corrupting. So these are really concerning statements to me about unlimited money and spending in politics from foreign nationals on issue ads and from moneyed interests. I do not believe that money is speech, and I do not believe that corporations should have the same free speech rights as individuals, but Judge Kavanaugh does, and I find that to be deeply troubling. Judge Kavanaugh also has a very disturbing record when it comes to rolling back civil rights of millions of Americans. In his time as a judge, Brett Kavanaugh has consistently sided against Americans who are trying to exercise their civil rights, from voting rights to employment discrimination to rights of those with disabilities. Judge Kavanaugh has taken positions that perpetuate inequality. Judge Kavanaugh's record leaves little doubt. If confirmed to the Supreme Court, he will continue to roll back hard-won rights of millions of Americans. As a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, Kavanaugh was involved in Rice versus Cayetano, which challenged Hawaii's right to limit participation in an election for the state's Office of Hawaiian Affairs to Native Hawaiians. In a brief he co-wrote with Robert Bork and Roger Clegg, the latter of whom heads the Anti-Affirmative Action Center for Equal Opportunity, Kavanaugh argued that restricting participation to Native Hawaiians was unconstitutional. According to Kavanaugh, it did not matter that Hawaii's voting qualifications in elections for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was designed to remedy past discrimination in voting against Hawaiians in Hawaii. Discussing that decision in an interview in 1999, Judge Kavanaugh said that the case is one more step along the way in what I see as an inevitable conclusion within the next 10 or 20 years when the court will say we are all one race in the eyes of government. Kavanaugh's adoption of Justice Scalia's approach from Adirondack Constructors versus Pena, that, quote, in the eyes of government, we are all just one race, indicates a belief that the government should be colorblind. Under this theory, affirmative action and minority contracting requirements would be constitutionally prohibited. Those are just some of the issues, Mr. President, that I care about and that New Yorkers care about. I'm very troubled about this nominee for so many reasons: for his record, for his beliefs, for his judicial temperament, for how he treated women senators during that hearing. When we vote on this nomination later today, Mr. President, when we decide if Judge Kavanaugh deserves to have the privilege to serve on the Supreme Court, there's just one fundamental question that I believe should be on all of our minds when we make the decision. Do we as a country value women? Does the Supreme Court value women? Does the Senate value women? Does the President? Most of all, does Brett Kavanaugh value women? Millions of Americans, millions of women are watching us today. They're waiting to see whether or not, when a woman comes forward and says that she is a survivor of sexual assault, does this chamber, do the individuals here take her seriously? Do we listen to her? Or do we disregard her and disbelieve her and patronize her? The last 2 weeks have been so incredibly painful for women who have experienced sexual trauma, for survivors all across this country. When they are watching some of the most powerful people in this country disregard Dr. Blasey Ford. They distrust her, they disbelieve her, they devalue her. It's painful for all of them. It's painful because they're tired of seeing the same old outcome every single time. They're tired of the same old scenario where the men are believed and the women are not. They can't believe their eyes when they see two women being treated with so little respect, with less of a process than even Anita Hill received. One of the worst parts of this process has been that we've been through it before, almost 3 decades ago. Anita Hill sat right where Dr. Blasey Ford did. She went through the same kind of cross-examination. She was disbelieved. She was patronized. She was disrespected. And we said that we would never put another woman through that. We said that we learned the lessons from that fiasco. And we said it would never happen again. But it did. And I really believe the process over the last few weeks was shameful. We should have learned from our mistakes, and we should be doing much better. But I can tell you, Mr. President, America's women are watching. They're watching what our leaders decide to do. They're watching who's listening and who's not. And they have made a decision that I could have never imagined or predicted. So many women in this country and men have made a decision since President Trump was elected that they are going to be heard. They are going to march. They're showing up at town halls. They're showing up outside federal offices. They're coming to Washington. They're knocking on Senate doors. They're speaking out. They're protesting. They're carrying signs. They are speaking their truth, and they're speaking truth to power in a way they perhaps never imagined they would do. They're running for office. Over 200 women are running for Congress alone as nominees of their party this year, more than ever in the history of America. And they're working hard to right the wrongs that they see happening in this country. They know that what makes this country great, what has always made this country great, is that we have cared about one another, that we are a country that believes in the golden rule, that we are a country that believes that you should care about the least among us, and that every generation has tried to make this country a more perfect union, whether it's fighting to end slavery through abolition, whether it's fighting for basic voting rights for all Americans through the suffragist movement, whether it's the civil rights movement saying equality is necessary in this country and people must be protected by the law, whether it's the LGBT equality movement to ensure that we can marry the people we love, whether it's people's desire today to ensure health care as a right and not a privilege. This is what our country's about. And I deeply feel that the process over these last few months have turned our back on that basic desire to bring our country to more perfect union, to a place where we value one another. Do we value women? Unfortunately, for too many in this chamber, the answer is no. So I hope that the American people are listening. I hope they are watching. I hope they will fight for what they believe in, their values, and what this country stands for. I yield the floor.